Now, we've understandably talked a lot today about the future of the Prime Minister and party politics in Westminster. But believe it or not, there are other very, very significant things happening abroad right now. The Pentagon says Russia is planning to fabricate attacks as a pretext to invade Ukraine. Again. Russia's dismissed the claims, of course, but has 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border, and talks between Moscow and NATO ended in failure this week. Earlier, I spoke to Volker, formerly the US ambassador to NATO and the special representative to Ukraine. He's worked under Presidents Bush, Obama and Trump. I started by asking him how dangerous he thinks the situation is.
I think it is very real, very dangerous, probably the most dangerous it has been since the last time Russia invaded, which was 2014. You remember then that Russia stealthily went into Crimea, used little green men and special forces, took over Crimea, did the same thing again in eastern Ukraine. And there's now been a war going on at a very low level for 7 years. About 14,000 people have been killed on the Ukrainian side. But it appears as though Putin has put in place all of the forces necessary to launch a fresh, new, large invasion. And he is making all kinds of threats to the West and to NATO that if he doesn't get some kind of guarantee about Ukraine being under Russia's sphere of influence, he's going to do it again.
It's thought unlikely that he would simply march across the border. The Pentagon says that Russia is planning a so-called false flag attack to fabricate a reason to invade. Do you think that's how this kind of thing starts?
It can. It's not the only way, but I think it can. I think what Putin was attempting to do, or what the Pentagon is saying he was attempting to do, was have Russian special forces acting as though they were Ukrainians, attacking the Russian-led forces in eastern Ukraine in order to give them a reason to come back and attack those forces and go massively into Ukraine. That's one way to get this started. There might be other ways as well. If you remember in 2014, Russia used regular military and special forces in unmarked uniforms to take over government buildings and declare an insurrection. And then when Ukraine tried to put down the insurrection, massively flowed in so-called humanitarian assistance, which turned out to be a lot of weaponry and a lot of troops. But I think that sort of thing, softening up the target, creating the pretext, it's also why he wanted to have these meetings with the US and NATO to get a rejection of his ideas. He's trying to create the pretext for justifying going into Ukraine again.
So that's how you read the talks in Vienna this week, which seem, frankly, to got nowhere.
Yes, and I think entirely predictable. Putin knew that the demands that he put into the texts that he gave to the US and NATO in December would be absolutely unacceptable. NATO is not going to say no countries can ever join again. NATO is not going to say that we will withdraw our military protection of the Baltic states and Poland. NATO is not going to say that Russia has a right to determine the future and security aspirations of its neighbors. Knowing that, why would he then propose these things? I think on the one hand, of course, if we were to give him that, he'd be happy. But more realistically, he knew he would get a rejection, and he wanted to show that he made the effort at dialogue and diplomacy, but he was rejected. So he, quote unquote, had no choice.
There's been a lot of activity this week. Ukraine was hit by a massive cyber attack, warning its citizens to be, quote, afraid and expect the worst. Now, we don't know who exactly is behind that attack, but if it does turn out to be Russian or Russian-inspired, because you've seen something similar in the past, what action could be taken?
Well, first off, let's analyze that attack a little bit. There have been cyber attacks against Ukraine, against Estonia, in the United States, against our election system, in Germany, even in the UK, I believe. So it would be fitting the pattern for this to be Russia, and surprising if it's not. Second, what is the message here? It is psychological pressure on Ukraine. We can attack your government ministries anytime we want to. We can put up our messages on those ministries. And we only did the civilian ones this time. We didn't do your military. The implicit threat being, we can do your military. So I think this is a lot of psychological pressure on Ukraine. As far as what can be done about cyber attacks, it's probably too late to prevent things now. It is something that all of us need to do in the West, in Ukraine, in our partner countries, help them build resilience against cyber attacks. But it's something that needs to be done constantly and with vigilance, not something that at the spur of the moment we can change.
Mr. Putin has massed 100,000 Russian troops on the border. He says, I can do what I like on my own soil. But it's evident that this is at some level a kind of intimidation. Well, what do you think his larger game is here? What is the point of all of this?
Well, I think it is what he said it is, which is he wants to prevent Ukraine from ever being admitted to NATO. He wants NATO to basically agree to tear up the Helsinki Accords and this idea that every state has a right to its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Every state can choose its own alliances. This foundation of security in Europe that's been in place for 50 years. He wants to tear that up and replace it with something more like Yalta, which is there's an Eastern sphere of influence, and that's ours, and there's a Western sphere of influence you can play there. And
this is a deal between Stalin and Western leaders.
Correct, yes. He's looking to go back to that as opposed to the arrangements for European security that have been in place for decades. And I would connect this to a vision that he has. Remember, he was a KGB officer in Eastern Germany. He was deeply disappointed with the fall of the Soviet Union, called it the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, and believed that it was the fault of the leaders of the Soviet Union at that time to allow that to happen. I think he sees himself in the mode of a builder of the greater Russia. And he seeks to acquire territories, as he's done already with Crimea, or occupies parts of Ukraine, of Georgia, or the soft takeover he's done in Belarus and possibly even now in Kazakhstan. So I think he sees himself as reassembling the pieces of a greater Russia. And this happens, of course, in the anniversary year of the founding of the Soviet Union. I think he'd like to emerge from this year having shown that he has built something big.
Let's get to the sharp end of this. You've spent a lot of time in talks with Russians. You've been involved in the politics of the Ukraine for many years. Do you think, in reality, that it is a real possibility that he could invade?
Yes, I would say that in my way of looking at it, it is more likely than not. His rhetoric has escalated to a point that will make it very hard not to follow through. It is clear that the West cannot give him the guarantees and demands that he is seeking. And I think that he actually will want to make some kind of invasion, some kind of territorial acquisition, but he'll want to do it swiftly. He'll want to stop within a short period of time and then try to connect these territories of Crimea and Donbass and maybe other parts of Ukraine and make them part of what is a sphere of influence for Russia by action, since he's not going to get that by words from NATO or the US.
Well, you say he won't get it by words. So what can NATO and the US do? For example, I guess there's some people who think that maybe to accede to the demand that Ukraine would never join NATO would be one way of at least getting him back to the negotiating table.
Well, what it would do is it would give him something and cause him to think, well, what else should I be getting as well? He's not going to stop with getting his demands met. We've seen this movie many times. And moreover, it is not for us to sign away the rights of 40 million Ukrainians. It is for them to decide the future of their own country. Now, what the US and Europe are doing is threatening massive retaliatory sanctions if Russia does invade again, increasing these military presence in NATO allies in Eastern Europe, and increasing security assistance to Ukraine so they can better defend themselves. But all of this is being framed as a response if Russia attacks again. And I think that what we really should be doing is taking all three of those steps, but doing it right away as a deterrent to such an invasion, with a promise that we could wind down some of that if Russia stands its forces down and we're no longer negotiating under the threat of the use of force.
So you would stand next to former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo when he criticizes the Biden administration for basically talking and not doing, because Pompeo has said that Putin is prepared to push to the brink, is his expression, in Ukraine to get what he wants. You are in favor of more aggressive tactics?
Well, I wouldn't describe what I said as aggressive. I do believe that we need to be doing rather than talking only. And I think that he's right about that. But helping a country get the armaments and training so it can defend itself is not an aggressive step. It is a prudent one to help stave off such an invasion. Putting sanctions against a country that is now using extortionist type threats against NATO, against Ukraine, against Europe, that's not an unreasonable thing to do either. And we'd be willing to lift those sanctions if Russia stopped its intimidating activity. I don't see these as aggressive moves, but I see them as prudent defensive moves to put in place to try to stave off something worse.
I was interested in the Pompeo intervention. Is this a sign that Mr. Pompeo is now gearing up for a run in 2024? Is this the opening of the political hostilities for the elections in states later on this year and then the 2024 presidential election?
Yeah, I read an article yesterday where there was a debate about when did the 2024 presidential election campaign begin? Is it 2022? Was it in 2020, just after the January 6th riots? Or did it actually begin in 2020 before the 2020 election and people were already jostling for 2024? I think it may have been the latter as well, too. No one knows at this stage who is going to run on the Republican side. It is quite possible that former President Trump would run again. There are a number of strong Republican candidates, Mike Pompeo among them, who might want to try as well. A lot of them are doing the kinds of things you need to do to prepare so they can make a decision later if they choose to run. And I think Mike Pompeo would be one of the stronger candidates if he did.